By the late 1970s, the average British household spent less than £12 a week on food for an entire family. £12. And out of that sum, lunch had to be covered 5 days a week, for working husbands, school-age children, and whatever was left for the woman who made it all happen. The sandwich was not a convenience, it was an act of daily engineering. If your mum packed your lunch in a grease-proof bag, if you ever came home from school to find 2 slices of something waiting on the kitchen counter, if you know what it means to stretch a half-pound of corned beef across 4 days of meals, this is for you. These are 15 sandwiches that fed Britain on almost nothing. Not recipes from a magazine, not food from a restaurant, food from a kitchen where nothing was wasted, and every penny was accounted for before the week began. This is file number 31 of the Forgotten Britain archive. The first sandwich on this list is not the most surprising, but it deserves to go first because it was everywhere, and because almost no one under 50 has eaten it the way it was actually made. The chip butty. Not the thick-cut gastropub version served in a paper cone. The real thing, white bread. Heavily buttered proper butter. Not margarine if the budget allowed, and chips fried at home in a pan of lard that lived on the back of the cooker. In Bradford, in Stoke, in the Gorbals, in terraced houses from Tyneside to South Wales, the chip butty was fried at. The chips cost pennies, the bread cost less. And the ritual of it, the steam rising when you pressed the 2 slices together, the way the butter melted into the edges was a comfort that no price index can fully capture. It disappeared not because people stopped wanting it, but because the lard went first. Then the white bread was declared a health risk, and eventually the whole thing became something to be embarrassed about, rather than proud of. But the chip butty was not the most economical sandwich on the weekly table. That title belongs to something older, quieter, and more patient. The dripping sandwich. If your nan kept a basin by the cooker, a white enamel basin with brown jelly at the bottom and solidified fat on top, you know exactly what this is. Beef dripping, collected from the Sunday joint, spread thickly on bread and finished with a pinch of salt. In 1974, a pound of beef, dripping from a cooperative butcher in a working-class neighbourhood of Manchester, cost roughly 4 pence. The bread was yesterday's loaf. The salt was already on the table. The total cost per sandwich was almost unmeasurable. Families in post-war Britain had eaten dripping out of necessity during rationing, and they carried the habit forward not out of poverty alone, but because it was genuinely good, rich, savoury, deeply satisfying in the way that processed food has never managed to replicate. It vanished from lunchboxes gradually through the 1980s, as the medical establishment declared animal fats the enemy, and margarine cheaper, lighter, and chemically produced took its place. The irony of what followed is something nutritionists are still arguing about. If the dripping sandwich represented the economics of the Sunday joint, the next one represented the economics of the tin. Spam. Specifically, spam sliced thin, cold from the fridge, laid on buttered white bread with a scraping of Branston pickle or a single leaf of lettuce when the garden allowed. Hormel Foods introduced their canned pork product to Britain during the Second World War as part of American Lend-Lease shipments, and British families absorbed it not as an American import but as their own. By the 1960s, a tin of spam cost around 1 shilling and 10 pence, roughly equivalent to 45 pence today, and would stretch to 4 to 6 sandwiches depending on how thinly the mother of the house chose to cut it. In Liverpool, it was eaten cold. In parts of Yorkshire, it was fried first, which changed the flavour entirely and made it something closer to a hot dinner between 2 slices of bread. The spam sandwich peaked in the late 1970s and began its long retreat as refrigerated fresh meats became cheaper and supermarkets arrived to reshape what a family considered normal. The tin never disappeared, but the ritual of opening it for lunch, of stretching it across a week, of treating it as the protein that held everything together that did. Not everything came out of a tin. Some of the most enduring sandwiches in this archive came out of the garden, or from whatever the greengrocer had left at the end of the day. The tomato sandwich is almost too simple to describe, but its simplicity is precisely the point. 2 slices of white bread. Butter always butter first, because without it, the bread goes transparent from the juice. Tomatoes sliced as thinly as possible to make them last. Salt and pepper, that is all. On a warm July afternoon in a back-to-back in Nottingham, or a council semi in Coventry, this was lunch. Not a side dish, not a snack, lunch. A large tomato cost a penny or two. A small loaf was under 15 pence. For a family eating this in the school holidays of 1976, the summer of the Great Drought, when standpipes appeared in the streets and the garden was bone dry, it was resourcefulness disguised as a meal. It vanished from the weekday table not because anyone stopped liking tomatoes, but because the sandwich became a vehicle for protein, and simplicity began to look like deprivation rather than sufficiency. There was another vegetable sandwich that did not rely on the garden and survived even the worst weeks of winter: the fried onion sandwich. A large onion, sliced and fried slowly in a little lard or dripping until they turned sweet and amber and soft, then piled onto buttered bread and eaten hot or cold. In the mining villages of County Durham and the mill towns of Lancashire, this was a common weekday dinner. Onions were among the cheapest vegetables available year-round. A pound of onions in 1970 cost around 3 pence. A single large onion, cooked properly, would fill 2 substantial sandwiches. The caramelization is what people remember, that sweetness that emerges when you cook an onion long enough. Something that feels expensive even when it costs almost nothing. It required time and a gas ring and patience. And the women who made it had all 3, because the alternative was going without. When convenience food arrived and the working week lengthened, the fried onion sandwich did not survive the schedule. It needed 20 minutes of standing at the cooker. The modern household decided it did not have 20 minutes. If you remember any of this, the smell of onions in the pan, the basin of dripping by the cooker, the hiss of the chip fat, leave a note below. Every comment becomes part of the archive. Now, the sandwich that caused more arguments at the school gate than perhaps any other. The fish paste sandwich, Shipham's or Prince's, usually a small glass jar with a foil seal and a label that had not changed since the 1950s. Salmon paste, bloater paste, crab paste. Spread generously, or as generously as the budget allowed, between 2 slices of white bread and wrapped in greaseproof paper or a bread bag from the previous loaf. A jar of fish paste in 1978 cost around 14 pence and would cover 3 to 4 rounds. It was economical, high in protein by the standards of what it replaced, and deeply divisive. Children who loved it ate it without comment. Children who disliked it traded it at lunchtime for something else, which is how the informal economy of the school canteen has always worked. The sandwich itself was entirely respectable until the 1980s, when the arrival of prawn cocktail crisps and chicken paste began to erode its position, and then the supermarket's deli counters arrived and made fresh sandwich fillings seem attainable even on limited budgets. Fish paste has never recovered. The jars are still on shelves. The ritual is not. Alongside the fish paste jar lived another British institution that now sits somewhere between beloved memory and national joke: the sandwich spread sandwich, Heinz sandwich spread. The pale yellow, slightly sweet, vaguely tangy condiment that contained pieces of vegetables so small and so uniformly chopped that their identity was indeterminate, spread thickly on white bread with perhaps a slice of mild cheddar if it was a good week. In a 1970s lunchbox, this was a standard filling, requiring no preparation beyond opening the jar and applying the contents. Children either accepted it without question or grew up to tell the story at dinner parties. It required nothing fresh, nothing from the fridge, nothing cooked. For a mother packing 5 lunches before 7 in the morning, that simplicity had real value. The jar cost around 22 pence in 1976. The sandwiches it produced cost almost nothing else. Cheese and pickle is still made today, but the way it was made in a working-class household of the 1970s on a tight weekly budget is not the same thing. The cheese then was typically a small block of mild or medium cheddar purchased from the counter at the cooperative, not from a supermarket shelf. It was weighed out to the ounce and priced accordingly. Families bought 1/4 pound, sometimes less, and it had to last. The pickle was Branston, always Branston, a jar of which could survive in a cool larder for weeks. The technique was to slice the cheese as thinly as possible, to cover maximum surface area with minimum volume. Mothers who did this well had an art form. They could make 4 ounces of cheddar fill 8 sandwiches without any slice being so thin it tore. The bread was buttered first, the cheese laid out, the pickle added with a knife, not a spoon, and the whole thing pressed firmly before cutting. Nothing wasted, nothing approximate. The economics were precise. There is a sandwich that sits outside the obvious categories, one that most people outside the north of England have never encountered, and that southerners tend to receive with disbelief when they first hear of it. The bread and butter sandwich. Exactly that. 2 slices of white bread. Butter between them. Nothing else. This was not poverty in an extreme or unusual sense. It was a practical response to a Wednesday when the week's provisions were running low and the next shopping trip was Friday. Children ate it without complaint because they had been taught not to complain, and because bread and butter was not considered a deprivation but a staple. In a Halifax primary school in 1969, a teacher surveying lunchboxes found that roughly 1 in 5 children on any given day had a bread and butter sandwich, not because their families were in crisis, but because that was what Wednesday looked like. The sandwich itself asks nothing of you. It gives very little back, but it kept people going, and that was the point. There are sandwiches built on economy, and then there is the egg sandwich, which occupied a slightly higher register, not expensive, but considered. Eggs were one of the few animal proteins that remained affordable throughout the 1950s and 1960s, even as meat prices rose and rationing memories lingered. A boiled egg, mashed with a little butter and a scraping of salad cream, spread on white bread. Or a fried egg, still slightly runny, laid between 2 slices in the morning and eaten before noon, when it had set cold and the yolk had hardened and the bread had softened around it. Some families added a pinch of white pepper. Some added nothing. In a Lincolnshire farm worker's cottage in the late 1960s, the egg sandwich was what a man took to the field because it cost almost nothing and provided enough sustenance to get to mid-afternoon. The egg came from the hens in the yard, which made it effectively free. The bread was bought. The butter was home-churned in some households and shop-bought in most. The economics were as close to perfect as any lunch could achieve. The sardine sandwich operated in much the same register, but entered the urban kitchen rather than the rural one. A tin of sardines in oil, drained and mashed with a little vinegar or lemon juice if you had one, spread generously on buttered bread and eaten cold. Portuguese sardines were being imported into British ports throughout the post-war decades, and a tin enough for 2 to 3 sandwiches cost around 9 pence in 1970. That made the sardine sandwich one of the most nutritious lunches available at the price point. Strong in flavour, pungent enough to clear a classroom or a works canteen of anyone within range. This was not a sandwich that concealed itself. It announced itself, and the people who loved it ate it without apology, which is perhaps the most working-class thing about it. Something gentler now. The cucumber sandwich has an association with the opposite end of the social spectrum, with Edwardian tea parties, with thin white fingers and cucumber cut so thinly you could see through it. But in the post-war British household, the cucumber sandwich belonged to nobody in particular. It was summer food, cool and refreshing, made when the cucumber was cheap and the weather was warm enough to want something light. White bread, butter, cucumber, sliced thin, a little salt pressed between the slices to draw out the moisture. Children, who were given cucumber sandwiches in the 1960s and 1970s, ate them without any awareness that they were consuming something associated with privilege. It was what grew in the garden. It was what was cheap in August. Class had nothing to do with it. The cucumber cost a few pence. The result was something that tasted, on the right day, almost elegant. There is one sandwich on this list that requires no refrigeration, no fresh ingredient, and no cooking, and it is the one that has perhaps the most complicated legacy of all, the Marmite sandwich. Marmite arrived as a byproduct of the brewing industry in Burton-upon-Trent in 1902, and by the post-war decades, it had embedded itself so deeply in British food culture that a household without a jar was unusual. A small jar in the mid-1970s cost around 16 pence and lasted weeks because the quantity applied was always thin, a whisper of Marmite, heavily supplemented by butter, on white or brown bread. It was given to children when they were ill. It was eaten by men going to early shifts. It was the last resort of a Friday morning when everything fresh was gone and the shopping had not yet happened. The sodium content alone could make a nutritionist wince, but in an era before nutritional labeling was standard, Marmite was considered strengthening, even medicinal. It divided Britain then as it divides it now, and the division is essentially complete. There is no middle position on Marmite, which is probably why it has survived when so many other things on this list have not. The last sandwich on this list is the one that required the most planning, the most organization, and the most understanding of how a weekly budget actually worked. The cold meat sandwich, Sunday's joint, a piece of rolled brisket from a Sheffield butcher, a small leg of lamb from a Birkenhead market, a half shoulder of pork from a Wolverhampton cooperative, was carved at Sunday dinner, and whatever remained was kept in the larder or the new refrigerator, if the household had one by the mid-1970s. Monday's lunch was built from what Sunday left behind. Cold beef on bread with a little mustard, cold lamb with mint sauce if there was any, cold pork with apple sauce or without. By Tuesday the meat was nearly gone, and by Wednesday you were back to cheese or paste or egg. The cold meat sandwich was the summit of the weekly meal plan. The direct heir of Sunday dinner, and making it last beyond Monday, required a skill in carving and portioning that most people reading this will recognize from someone they knew. It was not just a sandwich. It was evidence that Sunday had been good, and that nothing had been wasted. These 15 sandwiches were made in millions of kitchens, wrapped in millions of greaseproof bags, eaten in schoolyards and factories, and on park benches, and at kitchen tables. They were made on budgets that would seem impossible now, by women who had learned from their own mothers that waste was not an option, and hunger was not acceptable. The knowledge was not written down. It was passed across a kitchen counter, demonstrated rather than explained, absorbed through watching, and doing rather than reading. That knowledge is almost entirely gone now. The women who held it are in their 80s or 90s, or they are no longer here. What remains is the memory, your memory, if you are old enough to have eaten any of these, or the memory you carry from someone who told you about them. This was file number 31. There are 99 more in the archive. Subscribe and turn the page with us.